you want to plan for new visitors and you want to plan for the residents too. And so the last thing you want is to build animosity between the old guard and the new people. And I feel like if you do that the right way, there's something in it for everyone. And you might need to invest in trails and invest in workforce housing. But if you're going to have a thriving community, both investments will pay dividends.
Welcome to Trail Effect. I am your host, Josh Blum. Trail Effect is a show that dives into the stories behind trails, the communities that embrace trails, and the people who rely on trails as a way of life. The goal of this show is to turn the stories you will hear from our guests into useful knowledge that can be applied to your community while providing some entertaining and inspirational content. Guests on Trail Effect include trail builders, board members, community leaders, volunteers, and regular people who really enjoy trails. For episode 192, we have Jennifer Clinton and J.T. Horn, both of the Trust for Public Land. Earlier this year, the Trust for Public Land partnered with IMBA to author a report on the economic impact of mountain biking. They also presented this report at the International Trail Summit that was held this past April in Madison, Wisconsin. We dug into the report itself, along with some takeaways from the International Trail Summit during our conversation. I also want to say thank you to everyone who took time to say hi while attending the International Trail Summit. It means a ton. And while it's been a struggle to keep this show going, meeting and seeing so many people who enjoy this podcast means more to me than most will ever know. So thank you. Cooley Creative is the title sponsor for this episode. They design and build custom websites, as well as help companies with branding, photography, and e-commerce. Cooley Creative was started in Wisconsin, but is now based out of Bend, Oregon. Jared from Cooley Creative is a friend of mine. We've traveled together on multiple mountain bike trips, and sometimes he sends it. For more information about Cooley Creative, head on over to www.dudejustsendit.com. Yes, that's right. www.dudejustsendit will get you to the Cooley Creative website, so check it out. Trail One Components, exceptionally crafted mountain bike components that support great trails. I personally run the Crockett Carbon Bars, the American-made Rockville stem, and the Hell's Gate grips on both my Trail Light and Enduro bikes. These parts are the real deal, lightweight, bomb-proof, and comfortable for my old hands and wrists. Trail One goes beyond great gear. Every component is named after a real trail, and a portion of every purchase goes directly back into trails. So when you upgrade your bike, you are also giving back to trails. When you purchase Trail One components using the affiliate link on the Trail Effect website or in the show notes, you are not just supporting your favorite trails and upgrading your bike, you are also supporting this podcast. Trail One components offer a lifetime warranty along with fast and free shipping. Now on to the Trail Effect with Jennifer and J.T. of the Trust for Public Land. Here we are today on Trail Effect. I have J.T. Horn, who is a Senior Director and Trails Initiative person involved with the Trust for Public Land. And then I also have Jennifer Clinton. And Jennifer is a Senior Parks and Conservation Economic.
It's a tough one.
Economist. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'll cut that out. Maybe we'll leave the humor in there. Who also works for the Trust for Public Land. And the reason why we're here talking today is because there was recently a report that came out that had to do with the economic impacts of mountain biking. But before we get to that report, JT, how about you go into what the backstory is behind the Trust for Public Land and how the Trust for Public Land came to be?
Sure. Hey, Josh, thanks for having us on the show. So Trust for Public Land is a national conservation group. We're all about getting people connected with the outdoors. We were founded in California back in the early 1970s with the idea that conservation should be just as much about people as it is about nature. And so some folks from the Nature Conservancy who wanted to create parks and community gardens and places for people to get outside and not just focus on biodiversity. And so we've been working across the country. We've protected about 4 million acres and created about 5,100 parks and public land units in the last 52 years. And we have 30 offices. And so we have a pretty robust program helping conserve land and build parks for people.
Jennifer, how about if you go into your backstory and your role with economics and how that plays a vital part with conservation?
Hi, Josh. Thanks also for having us on the podcast today. So, my backstory is that I studied environmental economics. I was interested in how to use economics as a tool to advocate for conservation. We know that parks and trails and open space provides value to people. It's just not often quantified the way, the costs of creating those places are. So, I came to TPL about 3.5 years ago to join what's called the Lab for Land and People. We have a team of about 25 people. I am the sole economist, but we also have people in planning, GIS, evaluation, as well as our commitments and climate, health, equity, and community. And we are sort of the think and do tank for TPL to help our internal team and our external partners create data and analyze data that helps advocate for conserving these lands.
That's a land for parks and people, is that right?
Lab for Land and People. Land and People Lab.
Land and People Lab. That's an awesome lab name.
We started off as I think they called it the Institute, and we had a group democratic vote to go back to the lab.
I really like that a lot. Well, on March 27th, if I have the date right, you guys released a report that was the economic impact of mountain biking. Before we go into the report, let's dig into, and this is for you, JT, let's dig into the partnerships that were created to make this report happen and some of the backstory and why this report was important.
Yeah. So Trust for Public Land's been, conserving land and creating parks for a long time, as I explained in the backstory in TPL. And one of the things we've seen more and more is that communities want mountain bike trails, and it's seen as an asset for a lot of communities. And TPL has developed a national partnership with IMBA. We have a signed MOU with them, Memorandum of Understanding, that basically says we're going to partner. And IMBA is a great trail design build firm and a great advocacy firm, and Trust for Public Land is an amazing land protection, park creation entity with all these research capabilities at the Land and People Lab where Jen works. And so the IMBA TPL partnership really was thinking about how do we create more trails close to home. That's a shared vision between IMBA and TPL. And one of the things we realized was that economic arguments are one of the most important things when you're in front of a mayor's office or a county commission or a state parks agency. And people kind of intuitively knew that there was a real economic benefit to having a great trail system, that people would travel and spend money to go riding in these places. But IMBA was telling us, and my own field teams were telling me that, hey, it's really hard to digest all of the kind of academic research that's out there, and it's not very accessible to a layperson audience like a planning director or a county commissioner. And wouldn't it be great if there was a more accessible tool to talk about economics and biking? And I was like, well, we actually have this incredible capability to do research in-house. And so it was really after TPL and IMBA were working in Maine, in Madison, Maine, and Steve Kosacek and I were out in the woods. I know Steve's been on the program before. He said, it would be great if we could just get a summary of all these economic reports. And so that was the idea for this idea of a survey of all the literature that's out there and to try and summarize it for a layperson audience.
Jennifer, why don't we get your take on, once that partnership was formed, I'm sure that's where you got past the ball and said, here, make this happen.
Yes. And I have to say, IMBA was an incredible partner from the outset. They did have a lot of this information in-house. So they generously shared a lot of the research that they knew about, and then pointed me to some other destinations that were likely to have some of this research. So from the beginning, what we decided to do was focus on the mountain biking industry specifically. And I can talk about that in a second. And then second, I wanted to look at data that was published in the last 10 years. Of course, the pandemic changed outdoor recreation significantly. So we wanted to make sure, wherever possible, that our data was as recent as possible. And the other reason that we wanted to dive specifically into mountain biking is because the US Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes data on the economic benefits of outdoor recreation. They do that at the national level and the state level. But unfortunately for mountain biking advocates, cycling is really kept at a high level. It loops both road biking in with mountain biking and e-biking. So we wanted to be able to point specifically to mountain biking and the natural surface trails and the benefits those provide.
I didn't even realize the fact that when you look at the high level national data, it's cycling all lumped together, which, as you said, is mountain biking, road biking, e-biking. I could imagine that also includes, which is some overlap within what I just said, gravel riding. And when I say gravel riding, I'm going to more specifically refer to like rails to trails type of stuff, right? Which is where I live in Wisconsin. And as you all know, that's kind of the birthplace of some of the earliest rails to trail stuff. You've probably, if you didn't know that before the conference, you learned it at the conference.
Yes.
And I'm only, 20 some miles away from the start of the Sparta Alroy Trail, right? One of the trails that kicked that whole thing off. And so when you decided to just dive into mountain biking, how much more difficult was it to parse that out? Or were you able to parse it out because of what IMBA provided to you?
A little bit of both. So IMBA did have the mountain biking specific reports. So we started with those. And then when we went into the literature review process, we were able to identify a set of studies that focused just on mountain biking. So I think when we first started reviewing papers, we got over 50 that were cycling related. Some of them were outside of our 10-year timeline. But ultimately, we narrowed it down to 13 relevant studies that were geographically diverse. The scale and size of the trails were diverse, and they fit our 10 years and mountain biking focus. So we did have to streamline significantly, but I think the ones that we ended up selecting for the report were really representative of the diversity of what a mountain biking trail system can look like.
So knowing that this report came out in 2025, I would assume your 10-year window was actually 2014 to 2024. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, we spent the first couple of months of the 2025 year reviewing and editing and doing some last minute writing.
Was there any reports that were available during the COVID boom? Because especially those that are in the actual manufacturing side of the bike industry know that was like a huge thing. And now some people are calling it a bust. I still don't think it's a bust. I think COVID was good for getting people on bikes. And I believe that there's still more people on bikes now than there was in 2019 and beyond that or before that. But did you have any data that actually specifically came from that era?
We did have a 2023 study in Keene, New Hampshire that looked at the total annual spending of mountain bike riders, about how many people were coming to visit and their daily expenditure. So we did have that as a kind of a post-COVID or mid-COVID. I'm not sure how we're describing that these days. And then I have a second one for Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was written and published in 2022. And that included a little bit more data. They broke out information on visitors to the region separate from residents, which I find really interesting and helpful. Of course, often the biggest share of the riders are often people that live nearby because it's so easy to access. But it's also important to understand when you're attracting people from outside the region. It's what we can call like a true economic impact, right? Where we're trying to see the additional money brought into an area because of an activity. So it's one thing to sort of shift around what is already being spent on outdoor recreation, but knowing you've created a regional destination can have some really transformative benefits for our community.
Since you were working with IMBA, internally, did the topic of ride centers ever come up and how that may impact things?
Yeah. So, Josh, we were sort of limited to what academic research was already done. And so this is a literature review of other studies as opposed to original research. We'd love to do original research at some point and look at some of those ride centers, the gold, silver, branding that IMBA has built, because I think that's where you really get this idea of people traveling to a destination. but we were trying to gather all of the literature that exists. And so we didn't have enough to like sort of categorize into ride centers versus non-ride centers. But that's probably the kind of thing that, looking ahead for where economic studies could be done by either TPL or by a university or a consultant, like that's the kind of distinction that could really be useful to think about where you really see those differences in how you build infrastructure and what kind of amenities are there and how that affects visitation patterns and spending patterns.
Let's dive into the key findings. There's one key finding that has stuck out in my head since I first read this report, and that is $416.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's the number that sticks out in everybody else's head or something like that number, but let's dive into what that number is and what some of the other key findings were.
Sure. So in the report, I mentioned that we ended up focusing on 13 studies that fit our criteria of recent enough and focused on mountain biking. So $416 is the average expenditure per visit for people who are coming to an area to go mountain biking. So this looked at a really broad range of this size and scale and type of trails. Most of them are rural. We did have a couple that were urban, but that's sort of the average across all the sites that we looked at. And it was a pretty broad range, and the range, I think, depends on how long people are staying in the area. Partly, I think that's driven by whether they're coming for one trail in one area or if there's maybe multiple trails in an area that'll encourage them to stay longer. It also might depend on how expensive the hotels are in the area. But yeah, $416 was their average spending per visit. And that included hotel and lodging, their food, their transportation to get there, and any other recreational or entertainment activities they participate in.
What are some of the other key highlights or key findings that were found?
One other thing that was very helpful in the studies we looked at were some sites used this program called IMPLAN to estimate the broader economic impacts of their work, of their trails. So, for example, let me back up. IMPLAN is an economic modeling tool, and it's called an input-output model. So what you do is you look at what people are spending in an area, and this can point towards the sort of ripple effects in an economy. So you know what people are spending every day because you've surveyed them or you're, conducting phone surveys or something like that. And then you can plug it into this model. I'm oversimplifying, but essentially it'll say the direct spending is this, the indirect spending, people now are coming to the area and spending money at the hotels or other things like that. And then the induced effects are this. So people that are now employed because of that spending are spending on household goods. So I think one takeaway from the report is that mountain biking isn't just tourist spending, is that it really has a much bigger effect in the area than is often quantified. In addition to that direct, indirect, and induced data, it also estimates the job creation. So you can say because of that spending taking place in this mountain biking community, we can see how many jobs are created to support that. So what we found in those 13 studies was that up to 1,626 jobs were created, and they're earning $54 million, $54.1 million in wages and salaries. So that's a real, I was mentioning, this transformative economic benefits. I think that's a great case to point to for that.
And we need to point out this is just mountain biking. I want to continue to point that out.
Yeah. Yep.
So this is going to be a question for JT, and it's about, and I'm kind of going to phrase it about a community that actually wasn't part of the study, which is Cuyuna, Minnesota. But it's one thing that I remember that sticks out in my brain about when the trail system at Cuyuna was first built, which is up in the Iron Range of Minnesota. Money wasn't actually really being spent there initially. And the reason why was because nobody actually had anything to spend money on. There wasn't really the restaurants. There wasn't all the things that people would actually spend money on. And so people would come there, ride the trails, and leave. From a planning perspective, what have you seen, JT, in terms of like how, when a community, like Cuyuna or another maybe small rural community that had a bust of an economic driver, what kind of planning do people need to think about in terms of what they need to have to make that well-rounded community for visitors to spend money in their community?
Josh, it's a great question. So the second half of this report is what we called planning considerations. And so the first half is all about the economics and the dollars. The second half was really like, what do you need to think about if you're going to build one of these amenities and presumably people start coming? And it includes everything from, public safety, search and rescue, things like that, to really it's like tourism infrastructure. It's, how many beds are there in the community, short-term rentals, restaurant capacity. And one of the things we really recommend is that people get ahead of a big, burst in visitors, because what you don't want is for a lack of planning to create conflict between local residents who are probably used to like a quieter, sleepier place. And all of a sudden, all these new people start showing up to come ride bikes. That can be both an economic boom and potentially a source of conflict. And so we looked at a bunch of different places, and Kingdom Trails in Vermont was probably the one that I looked at the closest to think through, like, all right, what do you need to plan for? And so there's a whole bunch of recommendations about pay attention to your workforce housing, pay attention to your water and sewer, pay attention to your chamber of commerce and your, visitor services, even some basic tourism training, like helping orient people to like, all right, you rode bikes all morning. What can you do this afternoon? What other things are there to do here? Those are the kinds of things that help communities use a new asset in a great trail network to maximum effect and sort of depressurize the bad things and emphasize the good things.
Are there any trends and this is going to go into the other things to do, are there any trends that you've seen that really are helpful with other things to do? With one thing that pops into my brain is when I was talking to Jeremy Poor, who lives in the Old Fort, North Carolina area, he brought up that there is a place where you can do pottery.
Yeah. So I'm a New England guy, and I do most of my own travel for, outdoor things in the Northeast. And one of the things that I see over and over is that you might have a family that's all about biking and everyone rides bikes, but you also might have a family where, dad and the kids bike and mom needs something else to do, or vice versa, or, the grandparents are there, or like you go with a group of couples and some are hikers and some are bikers and you're all looking to like rendezvous at the end of the day for a meal out. Like finding places where you've got those sort of diversity of experiences is key. I was just in Chattanooga visiting our team in Chattanooga, and like that's an amazing town, and you can bike within the city limits. There's Stringer's Ridge, which is a Trust for Public Land project that was created. There's all these nodes of biking, but there's all this great other stuff going on in Chattanooga. It's an industrial city that's reinventing itself as a recreation city. And having like all of that other stuff, whether it's coffee in the bakery or a hard surface trail network or a water trail network or just great museums, like people are going to come and spend a period of time riding bikes, and you need to think about how they're going to spend the rest of their time. And it's those dinners out. It's that, what does that other, couple who's along for the trip do? And so, like when my wife and I were in the Pisgah area, like we were trail running when we were with a bunch of friends biking, and we would rendezvous in Asheville at the end of the day. And it was just a great outdoor experience for everyone. And those kind of diverse sets of recreation opportunities and services really make for a great destination.
Yeah, you brought up Chattanooga, and that place just has an incredible, vibrant downtown. They have the river that goes through the middle of it. They have an excellent food scene. They do have museums. They host a triathlon, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Not the triathlon, but events. That's just a great, great example of that.
Yeah. Well, just a follow-up thought there is that it can also work in Chattanooga is like a mid-sized city, but it can also work in the really small place too. There's an up-and-coming bike scene in Gorham, New Hampshire. So there's a little club called the Coa Cycling Club. It's run by a couple friends of mine. They've got a great network right in town, but they made one of the trailheads the local brewery. And so Big Day Brewery is owned by Jason Hunter and Kara Hunter. They're a couple. They own an eco lodge in Gorham, and they own a brewery in Gorham, and they made the eco lodge and the brewery the two trailheads, or two of many trailheads for the network. And so when I go there, I've got people with me that are biking and they're able to bike right out the front door and bike right to the brewery and can rendezvous with the people that are out hiking or just, being tourists. And so that ability to like design networks and plan things so that even in a small town like Gorham, New Hampshire, you can, have a seamless experience where you're not loading and unloading bikes constantly. You're able to sort of go from, where you sleep to where you eat to where you're riding, all in a seamless package. That kind of planning is really the way you get people to stay and spend multiple days and have a really great experience.
Jennifer, this is going to take me another tangent before we go back to events. Did you notice in the data if there is an increase in say numbers or even just the quality of the experience that you could pull out of it based on being able to ride, like park your vehicle, like JT was just talking about, and ride to the trailhead or run to the trailhead, versus having to get whatever your lodging is and then drive to the trailhead. Bentonville is super famous for it. There's, obviously you guys brought up more trails close to home right out of the gate. It's a huge benefit, but were you able to notice a direct correlation between how a community has that to offer versus not?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if anyone really quantified the difference between the two, but it definitely was identified in many places as a best practice that we want to encourage, for example, public transport that has bike racks attached to it, or being able to ride door to door. So I don't know if any of the sites that we looked at necessarily identified that, but it was definitely called out frequently as, a way to improve the relationship between the community and the mountain bikers. You're making sure the mountain bikers feel welcome while also, creating public transit opportunities in that example for the year-round residents as well.
And I know Coldwater, Alabama is one of your communities that you pulled research from, and they're currently working on. They just I believe in the last even maybe a few weeks connected downtown Anniston to Coldwater Mountain via trail.
I love that.
Let's get into special events in mountain biking. It's kind of going to go along the same line of, did you notice a big impact of communities that host high quality special events versus a community that is just a trail community? And what the event like kind of brought to the picture. I mean, obviously that's going to be, most events are of a huge influx of users during that event. But I think a lot of times, at least if you're like me, that bleeds over into like, hey, like that event was great. These trails are great. I want to experience these trails when these people aren't here and come here at a different time also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a weekend race or some kind of event definitely is a way to amplify and supercharge your economic impact. You've got however many riders you have, but they often bring family, they bring spectators. So the impact on the trails in terms of the economics is definitely much more not impactful. There's a much bigger economic impact when you're able to host a special event. There definitely is a threshold that you want to pass in terms of making sure you have tourist infrastructure in place before you get to hosting something like that. Making sure there are places for people to stay or camp or stay at an Airbnb. So I wouldn't say it's a silver bullet for every community that's investing in natural surface trails, but I think it's definitely a worthwhile goal.
This is going to go to both you, JT and Jennifer. We'll go with Jennifer first. Was there anything that surprised you in terms of highlights or stuff that stuck out that you that wasn't on your radar before you got into all this research?
Actually, I want to make sure JT got a special event note if he had one. I thought I saw you start to say something.
Well, just on the special events, Trust Republic Land did a project in West Windsor, Vermont at Ascutney. Ascutney is a dead ski area that went through bankruptcy, and through just local grassroots energy, they built a whole mountain bike network there, and they almost lost it all when the ski area was for sale. Long story short, Trust Republic Land bought the land where the ski area operated and turned it into the town forest. It's the West Windsor Community Forest now. And they're operating a ski area in the winter at a reduced scale, but the whole mountain bike trail network was preserved. And now that's where the Vermont 50 happens, which is a pretty huge race here in the Northeast. And they run a mountain bike festival there. and they use the ski area parking lot as kind of like ground zero for those special events. And if you go to the general store in that town on, the weekend of the Vermont 50 or the weekend of the Vermont Mountain Bike Fest, like the place is packed and it's driving people in a huge way. And that general store, it's now called the Brownsville Butcher, had been closed, literally like had gone under, and the doors were shuttered when the ski area was closed and before the mountain bike trails had been built. And by purchasing that land, revitalizing that trail opportunity to be both winter and summer recreation, that store reopened. It's now a destination. The food is great. The beer is great. It's a fun place to hang out. And it's literally brought a general store back to a town that was struggling. And so the events and the year-round strategy around biking, and it's like it will breathe new life into places that have seen job loss and seen business lost.
Okay, we're going to go off on a tangent before I go on to the question that I asked earlier, because now my brain went somewhere else, which is good. And we're going to go off of mountain biking specifically for a moment. And we're going to continue to talk about Ascutney. Since you purchased that land and it was, we'll say, a dead ski area, and you talked about year-round recreation, is there winter activity going on there? Maybe not in the form of operating chairlifts, but maybe still using the ski area for, say, like skinning up and skiing down and like more backcountry style skiing? Is that happening there?
Yeah, so the ski area still exists. It's run by a local nonprofit. They essentially have a management agreement with the town as the landowner, and they have a rope tow and a tubing hill, and then earn your turns where you skin up and ski down. And so they're keeping the kind of the core of the ski area going. It's not a commercial ski area in the traditional sense. I think a lift ticket is like $10. It's a really great thing. Essentially, it's like there's no snowmaking. It's a community run thing, but it's super fun to show up there on a Saturday in the winter and see all the kids sledding again. They had lost that for years, and no one was willing to invest in a small ski area that didn't have a ton of water for snowmaking. And so just getting it open and putting it into community ownership kind of brought new life back. And that continues with fat biking. Like, there's a whole fat bike network there. People are cycling there in the dead of winter. It's an awesome experience. The trails are great. There's a lot of like old fashioned New England rake and ride kind of, stuff there, but they're going year round, and all the condos and things that were slope side had become, just derelict housing. And now they're getting reinvested in again. It's a seasonal destination again. Hanging out in that town was super depressing a decade ago, and now it's a vibrant, wonderful place to spend the weekend again.
I love those stories because I live in a town that's probably way bigger than that, but we have a little hometown ski area that I think, or an independent ski area is probably the better way of saying it. And I think these little independent ski areas that, a lot of them you don't see being viable anymore, but still the amount of value they create for whatever community they're in is so huge that it's great to see those things continue to thrive or get, brought back to life, right? So let's go back to the question of what are some of the highlights or findings that maybe were surprising to both of you? And we'll start out with Jennifer on this one.
So I would say one of the takeaways for me was finding these great nuggets of stories of places that had really struggled economically, but were able to leverage mountain biking as a way to rebuild in some way, like Ascutney. So one case study we looked at was in Oak Ridge, Oregon. So when I was doing a little research on this community, traditionally they had relied on the timber industry, and when the local sawmills closed, they had lost over 1,500 jobs. So eventually they worked with the Forest Service and trail groups to develop a trail plan back in 2008. And today, I just confirmed on IMBA's website, they're now designated as a gold level ride center. I mean, they really, really invested in that and made it a very important part of their outdoor recreation economy. So I really loved finding stories like that about places that are relying on their natural assets in a new way.
How about you, JT?
Yeah. So I think the the thing that was great for me was actually seeing the dollars and the visitor numbers. Like we've all been to some of these places that are great places to ride, and you know that people are showing up, and you see, the new coffee shop popping up. You see the signs of new vibrancy in a lot of these rural communities. It's like one of the most impressive things for me, but just seeing the numbers and how many millions of dollars that represents, it allowed me to sort of move from like telling a great story to having some data to back it up. And so that to me was the most powerful. And so there's data from Colorado, there's data from Montana, there's data from Oregon, there's data from New Hampshire, there's data from North Carolina. It's not all 50 states, but there's enough data, and they all prove the same thing, which is tens of thousands of people come and they spend millions of dollars. And that's just really powerful when you do what we do, which is become advocates for land protection and trail creation.
Cattle Mountain Apparel, the brand that was built by travelers, hikers, trail runners, and mountain bikers, with the motto of venture far, laugh hard. While I definitely use Cattle Mountain Apparel for mountain biking, Cattle Mountain is also my go-to choice for daily wear as it is super functional and comfortable. Cattle Mountain Apparel also offers a lifetime gear repair program with the goal of extending the life of their products while reducing waste in the process. If you ever damage any of your apparel, Cattle Mountain will repair it for free for life. By using the affiliate link found in the show notes or on the Trail Effect website, a small commission will come back to the Trail Effect podcast, which helps to cover the cost of expenses for keeping this show going. Let's transition over to the International Trail Summit, because you both attended that.
Mm-hmm.
You also had a concurrent session that was specific to this economic report. How did that go, and what were some of the takeaways from that conference specifically in this report? And we can go with Jennifer first.
So I had the opportunity to co-present this report with Mary Monroe Brown of IMBA. She was an excellent co-presenter. And we were able to talk a little bit about how our organizations work together, about what our findings in the report were and how we work together. We had a completely full room. I actually did a little quick count. I think I saw about 75 people, standing room only, which was excellent. This is, of course, not an economics conference. A lot of these people were practitioners, they're trail creators. So I kind of went into this being my first International Trail Summit, not knowing if anyone wanted to listen to learn more about this report. And I was definitely very happy with the turnout. So we stepped through the report and the key findings, the planning challenges, and then shared some resources at the end where if there are communities who are interested in maybe understanding the economic benefits of their mountain biking trails, or if they're considering investing in these trails, how to work with TPL and IMBA to make that happen. So I was honestly very thrilled with the turnout. Everyone was super gracious and patient with me trying to pronounce Shawamigan. And yeah, we had a great time, and I met a lot of great people. So I'm glad we got to go. That was the hard one.
And the other thing I would add for me was that the people who showed up at the workshop came from really diverse backgrounds. So there's a bunch of people that are trail advocates, trail builders, but there are also a bunch of land managers that were there. And I think one of the things that was really interesting was all of the conversation that I had with state agencies in particular that were at the International Trail Summit that had looked at the report and were familiar with the launch of it and said, this is really great. Like, we have a strategy in our state around promoting tourism, promoting the outdoor recreation economy. And a lot of those folks pulled me aside at the conference and were really excited that we had done this report and, made it so accessible for just an everyday person. And so the offices of outdoor recreation and the state agencies, I think, are really hungry for this kind of data.
So I have this stack of business cards actually still at my desk from follow-up after the session. And just a quick glance at the people that were interested in this data. Someone from Warriors Path of Kentucky said, can I please have your presentation so I can just share this with the local decision makers? I think one takeaway was that it really simplified the economic data, but also stepping through the planning challenges, right? Like the report isn't just one thing, it's two. So he was hoping to leverage it for that. Others were interested in using this in their work in Vermont, Connecticut, and Maine. So definitely a big contingent for New England up there. So I have followed up with them and we've got calls set up. So hopefully there's future opportunities for collaboration with these groups as well.
Was there any questions that stuck out to either of you in terms of like what got asked during your presentation that maybe caught you, I don't want to say off guard, but maybe just like piqued your interest in terms of made it a memorable question?
Yeah, actually, one person asked me if I had or could focus on the benefits of adaptive trail design and having a more inclusively designed trail and whether we could point to any economic benefits of that. I had not seen that explicitly called out in the data. Like JT said, we would love to start doing original research on questions like this, but that definitely was not something I had expected, but was really glad to hear that that's something people are interested in.
How about you, JT?
I was just surprised that trail builders are so into economics. Like I was a trail crew guy back in the day and, pick and shovel work and yet, becoming a smart trail builder is about thinking holistically, and you're thinking holistically about like what kind of experience are people going to have when they come here. And I was really pleased to see that the trail builder side of the community wants to sort of understand the economics and tourism and all of these other elements. Because there was a bunch of people who are more like push dirt around kind of people who showed up at a presentation about, dollars and cents.
I can tell you firsthand as a person that works for a trail building company, we are getting these questions from land managers more and more. And in fact, and this is just totally coincidental, I was on a call with one of my coworkers and she had asked about any reports about economic impact studies. And it was honestly within like 2 or 3 weeks of this thing being dropped or after this was dropped. And I just said, hey, the Trust for Public Land just did an economic impact report on mountain biking that brings all these reports together. And I sent her the link in a chat. And since then, we are actually working together in Texas last week. And since then, she's like, I've pushed that report onto a whole bunch of different clients because we have that question that comes in regularly. It's especially on the municipal level, maybe not so much on the state and federal level, but on the municipal level, when you're talking to a mayor or a city council or a foundation that is really focused on their specific community, they hear that mountain biking is great, but they want to know what it actually is going to do, right?
Yeah, and I think, this is also where the report has its limits. I mean, it can't predict exactly how your community is going to respond to, an investment in trails. Every community is different. Every trail system is different. The tourism markets are, dictated by how far you are from population centers and all kinds of things. But to get one report that summarizes data from around the country, we felt like that was the missing link. And so, it's not like an automatic, here's exactly what you can predict, but it's more like rules of thumb and models of success and helping people with, a bunch of different data from a bunch of different places that, allows you to make an argument beyond a one-off of like, everyone's heard about the Bentonville success story. We purposefully didn't include Bentonville in the study because it's such a one-off. Like their Waltons have invested so much money in that system that's not really easily replicable. But we picked the ones that were, you could do this almost anywhere in the country. A lot of these smaller systems have really profound economic benefits, even if they don't have a major philanthropist backing them like they do in Bentonville.
I've had the question a lot of, let us talk to somebody in Bentonville so we know we can figure out how to do what they did. And as you both probably know, IMBA does their what's called IMBA Trail Labs, right? And actually this week is at IMBA Trail Labs in Winona, Minnesota, which is outside of Bentonville, 30 miles from where I'm sitting today. And I was really happy and impressed to see that IMBA moved it out of Bentonville, not anything against Bentonville, but to kind of help relay the message of, hey, this can happen in your community too, and it's a bit more relatable, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, is that we wanted to sort of pick sites and pick studies that felt relatable.
We've kind of talked about this whole time, but haven't talked about it in a more pointed way. What do you see some of the best practices are for how somebody should use this report now that it's out?
I can take a stab at that, Jen. So it's really an advocacy tool and it's a knowledge tool. So if you're a trail builder, trail enthusiast, and you're trying to get a new network off the ground, you're going to be on the hunt for dollars for planning and design. You're going to be on the hunt for dollars for trail building. And, one of the questions that any funder is going to ask is, what's the return on this investment? And these studies all point towards, real economic benefits. And so, we would envision it being used in a grant application, in a city council meeting, in a meeting with a major foundation or a major donor. It just gives credibility to a local advocate to say, hey, instead of telling me a good story, let me share some data with you. And so we view it mostly as, knowledge and power that makes your advocacy and your fundraising so much more impactful if you've got really good data and really good numbers backing you up.
Jennifer, why don't you add to that if you could?
I would say the second thing I was hoping for in terms of this report being used is actually related to my time before TPL. So I used to work for a regional planning agency, and I really wanted to also bring the planning perspective where and how I could to this report. So thinking through the smaller rural communities that might not recognize all of the potential implications of the natural surface trails. So I wanted to make sure that they were having early and transparent and frequent conversations with, if they're a trail advocacy organization, with their decision makers, with the residents, with the groups that could potentially be most impacted. Because I think if you're able to predict some of the conflicts that might come up, it'll help you plan your trail system better. Thinking about things like what are your suitable lands and what would those look like? How far are you from major population centers? Are people flying in? Are they driving in? What does that look like? Coordinating with emergency service access. Do you have a way for people to get help if they need it? And that could even include, do you have cell phone reception at a site? I live on Cape Cod, so I'm also hyper aware of what a second homeowner community, a tourism community looks like, the impacts on the housing market, the impacts on your local infrastructure, potential negative impacts on the environment. So I also wanted to make sure that while they have the data to convince the people that need convincing, that they're also having a very holistic and informed conversation about what this means for their community. I do think outdoor recreation economies are worth investing in, but it's important to have these conversations about potential impacts early on as well.
Yeah, you opened up a whole nother Pandora's box of stuff that we could talk about.
That's another episode.
Yeah. You want to build on that anymore, JT?
I think we've all been to a resort town where the people who wait tables, build trails, wash dishes, teach school, run the fire department, can't afford to live there. And that's a real problem. These resort economies, these recreation counties can have real challenges with attracting workforce, providing housing, providing services for everyday people. And so, we are big at Trust for Public Land about having the impact of our work lead to a thriving community. That's what we're all about. And more, that means, you want to create these great parks and public lands and trails and destination facilities that really want people to go there. But it also means we need to think about workforce housing. We need to think about the schools. We need to think about sewage. We need to think about all of those things. And we're really big on partnerships and planning. And so in Bozeman, Montana, we developed a new park, but we also did a workforce housing project right side by side with it. In Hanover, New Hampshire, we did a community forest, but we included 5 acres out of 255 acres that will be used for a future housing project. So there's all kinds of things that we are learning to do as conservationists to make communities thrive. And that includes paying attention to how everyday people, whether it's a teacher or a dishwasher or whomever is working in the service economy, can afford to live and make these communities go.
Yeah, those are all critical roles. And you hear the stories regularly of everyday people having to commute X amount of miles just to get into that resort community to work. And I don't know about you, but not a lot of people love commuting very far to work.
Yeah. And this is where the planning piece, you want to plan for new visitors and you want to plan for the residents too. And so the last thing you want is to build animosity between the old guard and the new people. And I feel like if you do that the right way, there's something in it for everyone. And you might need to invest in trails and invest in workforce housing. But if you're going to have a thriving community, both investments will pay dividends.
I think that's a great way to summarize this one or end it. With that, I always love to give both my guests, or all my guests, not both, it's two here, but all my guests, the opportunity to talk about anything that we may have missed that needs to be brought up during this conversation. And I'll start out with you, Jennifer.
I would say I have one more takeaway from the International Trail Summit. I had gone to the session on the Redhead mountain biking community, and they had done some really incredible and transformative work. One thing that really stood out to me was that they had done a 2024 user intercept survey. So unfortunately, they had just missed the cutoff for the report. But they estimated that they had seen 20 to 30,000 visitors a year, and their spending per visit was $495, which I was thrilled to see was, not too far off from the data that we had seen. But that was another example of a place that had a resource extractive industry, that they relied on timber and taconite or iron. So they had shifted towards investing in this outdoor recreation economy, and they're really seeing that pay off for the community. So I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I missed you for the report, but I'm thrilled that you're sharing this out with the world.
Yeah, and on that note, on Redhead, there's still active mining going on miles away from that place. And so they're actively moving into the outdoor recreation community and the benefits that it can bring before the other industry, is done doing their work.
It seemed like a really flexible approach, that they knew that they had to make some investments in order to get the trails up to speed, no pun intended, but they maintained the mineral rights in the area. So they know there's almost this like potential temporary nature of this trail system, but they decided it was worth investing anyway. And, I think a lot of people are very glad they did.
Redhead, Minnesota is or that whole Iron Range, I should say, is a great example of what outdoor recreation can do to keep these communities, thriving and what they need to have for the residents that live there. How about you, JT? Did you have, we'll backpedal and give us a takeaway from the International Trail Summit that you had.
Josh, I think there's another conversation that you and I have to have about how trail advocates and trail builders can partner with land trusts. It's funny, I was one of the very few people who worked for a land conservation organization that was at this event. And I really think there's a huge opportunity to build alliances between the trails community and the land conservation community. But that's a whole nother conversation.
It is. And we've already been talking about doing that conversation. I was at that session that you had presented at, and it is incredible. And we'll probably go into maybe how timber and conservation and mountain biking all go together in that conversation. How's that sound?
That sounds great. So let's do that at whatever point. And if people want to talk more about like how to work with landowners or have a parcel of land in mind, we at TPL are very eager to be the group to help acquire and protect existing trails or expand trail networks to serve communities. And just last week, we closed on a new expansion in Louisiana for Bogachetta. So apologies on the pronunciation to all the Louisiana folks out there, but that state park just almost doubled in size thanks to a Trust for Public Land acquisition. And I know as soon as the the ink is dry on the deed, there's going to be people out there looking at new routes that can be put on that piece of land. And that's the kind of work that we love to do.
Not to timestamp this podcast recording, but they just opened up the revamped Cortez coaster this last weekend on May 4th.
Well, I think we closed on our acquisition last Thursday. So that would have been like, May 1st or somewhere around there. So yeah, about 2,400 acres was added to that state park in a conservation transaction that Trust for Public Land and my great colleague Stacy Schenkel, put together down there. And he's been sweating the details on that. It's a multi-million-dollar land purchase. And but we got it done, and now it's part of the state park. And Louisiana State Parks and the North Shore mountain bike group will be able to go out and poke around and hopefully build some new lines.
Yeah, it's funny. Their acronym is NORBA. And for those that remember mountain biking in the 90s, NORBA was like the National Off-Road Mountain Bike Association.
Yeah. Well, I haven't met the folks there personally. And but yeah, like we love partnerships between trail advocates and trail enthusiasts and helping them get the land that, allows you to create these great spaces that serve communities.
And to bring this almost full circle, they're also thinking about adaptive riding and how they can serve that adaptive riding community in that area or in that region. So that's another great positive.
Awesome. Yeah.
Anything else that you want to close with, JT, before we send this one off into the world to listen to?
No, thanks for having us, Josh. It's probably the first economist you've had on the podcast. So thanks for hosting Jen and me and talking about trails from a different angle.
I really appreciate you two carving out time out of your day to get this one recorded. This report, as a person who's been an advocate forever and has gotten the questions about, how does this impact our community in a positive economic way? I'm glad that you were able to summarize all this and bring it all together in this report and for people to use. And I look forward to future reports as well. So thank you very much. Jennifer.
One thing I do want to add, a very final note, if people want to access the report, it's on TPL's website at tpl.org/econ mountain biking.
Yeah. And I will drop that into the show notes as well. So if they want to click in the show notes, there's going to be a link in there for this report.
Thank you,
but
Josh.
It's always good to verbalize that also. So people either know to look in the show notes or if they remember the website, they can just type it in. And it's the Trust for Public Land. It's very easy to find. You can Google Trust for Public Land Economic Impact Report, and you're going to find all sorts of stuff that you guys have done. Thank you for listening. If you like what you have heard, please take the time to share these shows with others. Sharing these shows will help create awareness of both the guests who have taken the time to be on the show and the podcast series itself. Also, if you're new to the Trail Effect podcast, check out our ever-expanding library of episodes. If you listen to the Trail Effect podcast on Apple or Spotify, please don't forget to leave a rating and review, as this is one of the best ways to show our support for the Trail Effect podcast. Also, don't forget to check out Cooley Creative at www.dudejustsendit.com. For additional ways to help support the Trail Effect podcast, check out the affiliate links tab at the Trail Effect website, where you'll find links to Kettle Mountain Apparel, Worldwide Cyclery, and Trail One components. By using the affiliate links found at www.traileffectpodcast.com, a small commission will come back to the podcast, which will help keep this thing going. This podcast has been edited and produced by Evolution Trail Services. Thank you again for listening.